What are the things that people should be looking for, with themselves or with a friend to know that it's actually grief per se? Like, are there any like actual things that they could notice or like key things to be like, okay, this is actually what I'm going through, even if they now understand what it is, but to be able to really pick up on it?
That's a really good question because it can look so different in different people. But any shifts in a person's behavior or the way they interact with you could potentially be secondary to grief. A lot of us, when our loved ones get upset or angry with us, we assume we can take it very personally, like, oh, we've done something wrong. In this time, anything really goes. I've had patients I know come to me and tell me, oh my gosh, like my boyfriend yelled at me and he's never done that before, or my mom kind of didn't pick up the phone and she always does, or there are all these kind of little changes in people's behavior that can definitely potentially be secondary to some kind of grief reaction to loss or some perceived loss.
Is there any, I guess, things that they would be able to, any implications they might feel to maybe their mind or their body that they also might notice, like, will they feel fatigued? Will they feel like, I guess I know you said irritable, but is there any other things that they might feel that might impact, what's going on in their day to day and things like that?
There's a lot of overlap here. I mean, we're talking about something is grief, and there's a lot of overlap here on anxiety, uncertainty, right? And so to your point, absolutely. People feel more fatigued. They feel like they can't pay attention as much. They are more forgetful. They're not sleeping well. They either, can't fall asleep, or they're waking up in the middle of the night, or they're waking up early or later, just not feeling well rested. The added sort of complexity here is that people are also indoors, right? They're in their homes, or they're at work under very stressful circumstances. And so just other things like, people can feel dizzy, lightheaded because they're not hydrating well enough, or they're just overly stressed, and that can just cause lightheadedness in general. And so all these kind of like sort of vague, non-specific like feelings can absolutely pop up kind of physically as well.
What can people do to kind of help each other through this?
On the whole, whether or not you have any idea what that person is going through, I think right now, in this time in particular, we need to work towards finding it in ourselves to be as compassionate as we can. Compassion essentially is telling and showing someone that there is space for their experience. And as soft and fluffy as that sounds, it's actually like a very serious human need, like clinically very serious human need. I can't stress that enough. And so making space for that, I think, is hugely important. And that can be as simple as sitting quietly with someone when they're not feeling well. It can be as simple as just taking a moment to actually ask, like, hey, how are you feeling? I've noticed you've been more X, Y, or Z. What's important to clarify is that when I say compassion, I also mean self-compassion. And so what that means is, how can I be compassionate? It's like kind of the whole oxygen analogy of like, how can I be compassionate to myself first? Therefore, I have the reserve to actually be compassionate to somebody else, because compassion takes work, it takes energy, it takes, but it can also be very fulfilling. It can be very soul enriching. And so there is this sense of like, once you get past that initial bump of like the energy it takes to actually even start being somewhat compassionate, right? After that, it's like, okay, it can actually be very fulfilling to you as well, and can kind of fill your gas tank, if you will.
I think when people are going through things like this, collective grief, whatever it be, they inherently judge themselves. People are inherently very hard on themselves when this happens. So how can someone steer clear of self-judgment during this process?
That's the question for the ages, whether we're in a time of a pandemic or not, right? I think it can be so ingrained in us, we don't even realize we're doing it. The goal here is not to never self-judge. The goal here is more to notice when you're self-judging and kind of do what you can to actively choose to engage in a different conversation with yourself. I'll use myself as an example. But if I were to wake up late, right, and I'm, feeling like I'm behind on the day, I have so much work to get done, and I've already kind of missed my first 2 hours of productivity, automatically I'd probably say, oh my God, like I should have gotten up earlier. I should have been able to exercise before I started working. I should have been able to get more done today. Oh my gosh, like now I'm going to be behind. And like, that means that I'm kind of failing. I mean, that's kind of like the deepest core feeling or thought. That might lend itself to me kind of getting up and being productive for the rest of the day, or it might lend itself to me just kind of wallowing in that kind of shame of like, oh, what's wrong with me, right? Why couldn't I do this? Figuring out what are those things you're even saying to yourself, how are you judging yourself so that you can notice it and catch it. And then when you do, it's kind of like a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy kind of restructuring of thoughts, right? It's like, how do I change that conversation? Okay, like, girl, it is a hard time right now. You are fatigued. Like I said, like, people are already more fatigued than they usually are. Maybe your body needed that rest. It's okay. Like, listen to your body and what it needs. That's like the first step, right? Because you are acknowledging that you actually need something and that you're giving yourself that thing that you need. Shifting that even narrative from one of like judgment to one of like compassion, of like, you got this. Like, this happens. Like, moving forward. Is, I think, an encouragement, compassion and encouragement, I think, is all we can really do, right, in this time, because it's super hard to like catch yourself judging. Even that takes judging yourself, right? It takes a lot of energy, but it's absolutely possible, and it just takes practice, like anything else. You can't lift like 200 pounds on like the first day, but you start with 10 and you work your way up, and so it's kind of an incremental sort of shift.